This episode is sponsored by the Manhattan Rare Book Company. In 1954, J.R.R. Tolkien was 62 years old and had just spent the last 16 years working industriously on a book. It was now time to release it into the world, and he was very nervous. And he should have been, because no one had seen anything quite like The Lord of the Rings before. It was a huge risk for the publishers, who were convinced that it wouldn't sell many copies. Who was the audience for this strange book filled with unfamiliar and unpronounceable names of people and places? Was it a children's book like The Hobbit? It certainly had wizards and strange creatures, and it was also an epic adventure of some kind. It was also very, very long. 3 volumes, in fact, and several appendices. But no, it was neither a children's book or an adult novel. Tolkien wrote to his publisher at the time,
"My work has escaped from my control, and I have produced a monster, an immensely long, complex, rather bitter and rather terrifying romance, quite unfit for children, if fit for anybody. I now wonder whether many beyond my friends would read anything so long."
We can only imagine what was at stake for Tolkien. If the first volume wasn't a success, what would happen to the other 2 volumes, which he had spent the best part of 16 years writing? In the early 1930s, when Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, he was grading papers when he noticed that one of the candidates had left a blank sheet of paper.
Nothing to read, so I scribbled on it. I can't think why. In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit.
And so, the Hobbits were born. The Hobbit can broadly be considered a prequel to The Lord of the Rings. It introduces Tolkien's world of Middle-earth, the world of hobbits, wizards, dwarves and elves, but it is a much different book with a different intended audience. Upon publication, Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis compared The Hobbit to such classics as Alice in Wonderland and The Wind in the Willows, and like those works, it has often been considered a children's fantasy book, written primarily for children or adolescents, but enjoyed by adults as well. The Hobbit was a huge success, and only a few weeks after its publication, Tolkien met with his publisher Stanley Unwin to discuss a sequel. The writer expressed his desire to publish a long, detailed mythological work about Middle-earth called The Silmarillion. But Unwin insisted that what the public really wanted was more stories about the hobbits. He wanted The Hobbit too. Tolkien and Unwin had variations of this debate for the entire 16 years Tolkien was working on his next book. Ultimately, The Lord of the Rings succeeded in developing Tolkien's Middle-earth without losing the narrative appeal of The Hobbit. The result was not so much a sequel, but a much more complex adult work. In the process, Tolkien had invented a whole new genre. The fantasy novel, in his later years, professed to love the simple life, much like his beloved hobbits in the Shire. This desire for peace, security and companionship, however, was likely the result of his upbringing and young adulthood, which was anything but peaceful and secure. This quintessentially English professor was born John Ronald Reuel Tolkien in Bloemfontein, in what is now South Africa, in 1892. In 1895, Tolkien, his mother, and his infant brother Hilary went to England for a visit to his mother's family, who, like her, were British. But soon after their arrival, his father died in Bloemfontein of rheumatic fever, leaving the family with very little inheritance. The family stayed in Britain, where she had the support of her family, and moved to the small village of Sarehole, just outside the industrial city of Birmingham. Although they didn't have much money, Tolkien became captivated with his environment. He would later say,
"It was a kind of lost paradise. There was an old mill that really did grind corn with 2 millers, a great big pond with swans on it, a sand pit, a wonderful dell with flowers, a few old-fashioned village houses, and further away a stream with another mill."
The village scenery would inspire the Shire. but it was just outside the major industrial city of Birmingham, which was expanding rapidly and in the process absorbing the surrounding villages.
I was brought up in considerable poverty, but I was happy running about in that country. I took the idea of the hobbits from the village people and children. The hobbits are just what I should like to have been, but never was. An entirely unmilitary people who always came up to scratch in a clinch. Behind all this hobbit stuff lay a sense of insecurity. I always knew it would go, and it did.
The theme of the destruction of idyllic countryside would fill his literature. Tolkien's mother Mabel was the primary influence on his early life. In 1900, when Tolkien was 8, Mabel converted to Catholicism. Her family, who were Methodist, disapproved. Her father disowned her, and her brother-in-law, who had been assisting her financially, withdrew his support. It was a spectacular fall from grace, a theme we often find in Tolkien's books. She homeschooled him until the age of 8, encouraging him to read widely and introducing him to the works of George MacDonald and Andrew Lang, early developers of fantasy literature. In 1904, however, when Tolkien was 12, Mabel died of diabetes, hastened, Tolkien later believed, by persecution for her faith, leaving her 2 sons orphaned with bleak prospects. He took refuge in language, learning Chaucer's Middle English, the Old Norse of the Viking sagas, the Old English of Beowulf, and even reviving long-dead languages and inventing languages of his own.
I first began seriously to invent languages about when I was 13 or 14. I've never stopped, really.
School was a haven for Tolkien. He first attended King Edward's School in Birmingham, and it was here, crucially, that he formed his first literary group, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, 4 friends who played rugby together and talked about Norse mythology while drinking tea and inventing languages. Groups like this were important to Tolkien, a fatherless boy and now an orphan, and it was the first of many literary groups that Tolkien would form, a fellowship of sorts. Even this early on, he was obsessed with myths, legends and folklore, and concerned with creating a British mythology. He won a scholarship to Exeter College, Oxford, and unsurprisingly, he showed a special aptitude for languages, Old and Middle English, Old Norse, and Gothic in particular, graduating in 1915 with a degree in English language and literature with first-class honours. And it is these studies that will lead to the creation of a series of languages in Lord of the Rings, which are among the most fully developed fictional languages in literature. But 1915 could only mean one thing: war. And almost immediately after graduation, he was commissioned into the Lancashire Fusiliers. The Lord of the Rings is, at its most basic level, a hero's quest. But the hero in this case is not someone strong and fierce like Odysseus, Beowulf, or Aeneas, but the hobbit Frodo Baggins, a diminutive creature who at his core, like other hobbits, wishes to be left alone to enjoy peace, good food, and fellowship in his homeland, the Shire. Frodo has no special abilities and is extraordinary only in his courage, loyalty, and incorruptibility. And the quest of Frodo and his companions is most unusual. Instead of trying to gain power, they are dedicated to the destruction of the one thing, a magical ring, that would give them great power. In fact, the quest succeeds because the idea that someone would forego power and intentionally destroy the most coveted possession in their world is a thought that is impossible for their enemy Sauron to anticipate or even to contemplate. Tolkien was an academic, deeply steeped in the tradition of the epic, but he also knew how to subvert those traditions to create a new kind of epic that addressed the fears and concerns of his generation, the generation of World War I. War of one kind or another permeates the Lord of the Rings, through death and loss, through notions of power, through camaraderie in deathly times, and eventually through disappointment. Tolkien took part in the Battle of the Somme, one of the most horrific battles of the 20th century. Over 3 million men fought in the battle, which saw over 1 million killed or injured, scarring the earth in one of the most deadliest battles in human history. He saw many of his school friends die in the fighting, and by 1918 he said that he had lost all but one of his closest friends. In some sense, he was lucky to have contracted a severe case of trench fever near the end of the Battle of the Somme and sent back to England to recover. While convalescing in army barracks, with the war very much fresh in his mind, Tolkien put to paper much of the story that would later become The Fall of Gondolin, a story published after his death of a cataclysmic battle featuring orcs, dragons and balrogs, and notably his first work to feature Middle-earth.
They walked slowly, stooping, keeping close in line, following attentively every move that Gollum made. The fens grew more wet, opening into wide, stagnant meres, among which it grew more and more difficult to find the firmer places where feet could tread without sinking into gurgling mud. Wrenching his hands out of the bog, he sprang back with a cry. "There are dead things, dead faces in the water," he said with horror. "Dead faces!"
Although Tolkien here is describing the outskirts of Mordor in his fictional Middle-earth, it is not hard to imagine this as a description of Tolkien's experience during the Battle of the Somme. The First World War begins as a battle on horseback, with cavalries, but it is the beginning of mechanized warfare. Characters in Lord of the Rings describe being watched by mysterious figures flying overhead, and in 1914, airplanes on both sides were first used for reconnaissance, flying deep behind enemy lines. Over the course of the war, aviation developed significantly into a major force, and by the end of that war, it was obvious that airplanes were the weapon of the future.
Then Frodo and Sam, staring at the sky, saw it come. A small cloud flying from the accursed hills, a black shadow loosed from Mordor, a vast shape winged and ominous. It scudded across the moon and with a deadly cry went westward, outrunning the wind in its fell speed.
He is at the Somme, when tanks were first used, and although orcs make up the bulk of Sauron's army in The Lord of the Rings, one of his most powerful weapons was the tanks of Middle-earth, the Oliphants.
A state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings at the outbreak of the Second World War, late 1937, so the world was once again on the precipice of war. Tolkien denied it was an allegory of any kind in the foreword to the book, but also admitted that an author is influenced by his experiences. The writing of the novel began during the rise of Hitler and continued during the darkest days of World War II, when all hopes of a peaceful new world order had vanished, especially for someone living in England and in constant fear of air raids and Nazi victory.
If you really come down to any large story that interests people, hold them attention for a considerable time, or make stories, practically always a human story, is practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death.
The First World War almost certainly had more influence on Tolkien, but Lord of the Rings can also be considered part of post-World War II literature that includes The Lord of the Flies, 1984 and Animal Farm. Books that were marked by their authors' wartime experiences and deal with the question of good and evil.
Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled.
In The Lord of the Rings, there is the rise of an evil force, Sauron, who is not unlike Hitler in his desire for power and world domination. Just like countries during the war, some societies in the book, whether out of self-interest or fear, side with Sauron, adding to the hopelessness of the good-hearted. The fate of the world is at stake in both worlds, and the outcome hinges on a race to prevent ultimate power getting in the wrong hands. Crucially, the ring is not just about power. It is about what we do with power, and how it can corrupt us, and how that corruption can be addictive, leading to the eventual loss of your humanity as the evil within you is exposed, absorbing all morals. The very things that were being discussed at the outbreak, during, and at the conclusion of World War II. The horrific evils of the 20th century were just around the corner. Despite the horrors Tolkien witnessed firsthand, The Lord of the Rings is not, as you might expect, explicitly anti-war. The Lord of the Rings is in fact a book about the unfortunate necessity of war when it is a just war against evil. But crucially, Tolkien also understood that there was good and evil on both sides of war, an unpopular sentiment in a time when those boundaries were being blurred beyond recognition. He was outspoken against bombing campaigns on German cities, and even used a quote from The Lord of the Rings in a letter to his son about the campaigns.
You can't fight the enemy with his own ring without turning into an enemy.
He knew, as the characters of the Fellowship do, that just because one fights for good, it doesn't make one immune to the power of evil, to the power of the ring. The Fellowship must resist the temptation of the ring, as we must resist using evil to fight evil. Tolkien understood that bravery is a complex notion, for while battles swarm around him, it is our little hobbit Frodo who succeeds on his journey by avoiding war. But even he is not immune to war's effects and trauma. When the war is over and he is returning to the Shire, Frodo confesses to Gandalf in one of the most poignant passages in the book that he is in pain, as so many shell-shocked men of the trenches were.
Alas, there are some wounds that cannot be wholly cured, said Gandalf. I fear it may be so with mine, said Frodo. There is no real going back. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I am a long burden. Where shall I find rest? Gandalf did not answer.
After World War I, and certainly during World War II, artists and writers had to wrestle with a new reality. How to present life in the aftermath of such horrors? Were the old stories of heroism even relevant anymore? Tolkien, through his fictional world, has reinvented the heroic epic for our times, giving us a fresh and more ambiguous perspective on modern warfare, through the realm of fantasy. You may get all the heroics, but there are also points when his greatest heroes are full of fear. Reducing The Lord of the Rings to a heroic quest or a war narrative is convenient and an aid to our understanding, but ultimately does disservice to the book. It more likely just exposes our difficulties in identifying exactly what this strange work is.
If you want my opinion, a part of the fascination of The Lord of the Rings consists in the vistas of yet more legend and history, to which this work does not contain a full clue.
The action of the book takes place over a relatively short period of time, but throughout The Lord of the Rings we hear tales and legends about the past, often stretching back thousands of years. Tolkien hasn't just written a story, but has given us the impression that we are witnessing a series of events inside an entire history that exists outside of the books. Although he is just one writer, he has created an entire mythology comparable to traditional cultural mythologies.
And you took 14 years to make the story?
Quite so, yes. And I took 14 years, not for the general things it is now, but finding time schemes and getting everything right and so on.
Documenting the history of Middle-earth was a lifelong project of Tolkien's. In his letters, notes, and unpublished works, he filled in details of this mythology, complete with elaborate genealogies and geographical details. Tolkien had the genius to make it sound like it was a real history he was exploring, as if he was just researching it and reporting it to us. There had been fantasy books before Tolkien, but never had there been such successful world building with such a serious tone and seismic events.
What I'm doing now is to try and write in Elvish, because my writing is very inferior to the Elves. Their standard greeting when meeting, a star shines upon our meeting.
From 1924 to 1945, Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, and even after the huge success of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he continued to teach at Oxford until his retirement in 1959. He developed 15 different dialects for Elvish for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And as a soldier during World War I, Tolkien even developed a secret code to communicate with his wife. For Tolkien, language is where it all begins.
The invention of languages is the foundation, To me, a name comes first and the story follows.
He believed that the nature of a society was inseparable from its language. To understand a people, you must understand the language. The sounds, syntax, and expressions can all evoke a mood and reveal the values of a people. And Tolkien has given all of his fictional races in the book not only their own complex history, but also their own fully developed language, with its own alphabet, expressions, and sounds. It is a remarkable encyclopedic feat that fleshes out even the most minor characters. Catholic Marian hymn. The sounds are flowing and musical, reflecting how the elves speak, underscoring their reverence for grace, beauty, and nature. The dwarves, however, speak the more direct language of Khazd-dûl, reflecting their emphasis on craftsmanship and precision. The language of the hobbits is filled with colloquialisms and expressions centered around the simple pleasures of life. The orcs have a savage and guttural tongue that exposes their brutality. Even among the races of man, Tolkien uses distinguishing styles. The Rohirrim pepper their language with references to horsemanship and warfare, while those from Gondor speak with a more formal and elevated style, emphasizing their nobility and ancient heritage. Passages in invented languages help create an immersive experience and are critical to Tolkien's world building. We become convinced that we are learning about a time different from our own, from a historical world that really did exist. Tolkien felt so strongly about the centrality of language to his work that he once commented that he would have preferred to have written The Lord of the Rings entirely in Elvish, but ultimately left in only as much as he thought his readers would endure. Because of Tolkien, invented languages have now become standard in fantasy epics, most recently seen in modern versions of Dune and Game of Thrones. This chapter comes at the end of the book and doesn't feature in many of the films, but is an integral chapter when looking at Tolkien. It is a deeply pessimistic look at what happens when our returning heroes, the hobbits, go back to their Shire, this bastion of Middle England, these idyllic agricultural spaces, to find that everything has changed. Industry is now polluting their once pure rivers, and the Shire is now, in effect, a police state.
It was one of the saddest hours in their lives. The great chimney rose up before them, and as they drew near the old village across the water, through rows of new mean houses along each side of the road, they saw the new mill in all its frowning and dirty ugliness, a great brick building straddling the stream which had fouled with a steaming and stinking outflow. All along the Bywater Road, every tree had been felled.
This is a classic idea of the homecoming hero facing further obstacles that we can find in Homer's Odyssey, amongst other quest literature. The Shire is now run by ruffians, with a dictator-like chief, whose gatherers count, keep track of productivity, and enforce endless rules. The hobbits' inns are closed because the chief disapproves of beer, and beautiful old dwellings are demolished to create ugly new ones. Surely a reference to the desperately needed new social housing post-World War II. And there are hundreds of sheriffs, a kind of hobbit police force, who drag anyone who stands up for their rights to prison. We can go back to Tolkien's experiences in World War I, when returning veterans were promised a new life fit for heroes, but in fact returned to unemployment, continuing poverty, homelessness, and even worse, the wholesale destruction of their way of life. It was a betrayal. Tolkien was famously anti-industrialization and politically conservative when it came to big government, and this can be seen as a veiled attack on the post-war Labour government, and what conservatives saw as interference, regulation, and even socialist ideology. At one point, the hobbits discuss the gathering of local farming produce so it can be shared out equally. But this ideal never quite works the way it should do, a scathing critique of socialist principles. The Scouring of the Shire chapter was written after the end of the Second World War, And I think it's hard to deny, although Tolkien did, that there is also an allegorical element to this chapter, with the ruffians' behaviour echoing the Nazis in the way they used collaborators, informers, threats, torture, and the imprisoning and killing of dissenters. At one point, the Sheriff Hobbit says,
"I am sorry, Mr. Merry, but we have orders."
A chilling phrase that we will hear time and again at the Nuremberg trials. These are all reflections which would have meant so much more to a British reader in the 1950s. The rapid pace of change in terms of industrialisation, devastation of the countryside, regulations of all kinds, government interference, and the advent of Big Brother. Yes, everything had changed while the hobbits were away, but everything had changed for the British too. This is one of the most complex and contentious issues surrounding Tolkien, a committed Catholic in a Protestant country, and one who stated categorically that Lord of the Rings was not a religious allegory. In many ways, it is a pagan book and draws on those sources of the Norse myths, which are pre-Christian. There are no churches, no religion, and no God in the Lord of the Rings. And yet, when Tolkien was attacked upon publication for the apparent lack of religion in the book, it was, he confessed,
"the only criticism that annoys me."
Tolkien is clear that in such a pre-Christian world it would have been incongruous to include any explicit references to Christianity. And yet, in a private letter to the Catholic priest Father Robert Murray, Tolkien explained,
"The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in, or have cut out, practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism."
Much has been made in Tolkien's scholarship of this letter, for it seems to conflict with his other more public statements.
People do not fully understand the difference between an allegory and an application.
But what does it actually mean for a book to be religious, or in this case, a Catholic work? Do we have to, as many have done, make the case for Frodo as a Jesus figure, or make direct parallels between Christianity and Middle-earth? Certainly there are strong Christian elements throughout, most evident in the larger themes of the importance of sacrifice and selflessness, the focus on hope and redemption, the lure of temptations, and the existence of evil. These values, and others, however, also overlap with similar themes in pagan literature, or Norse myths, or countless other sources Tolkien would have studied. Perhaps it is simply a case that being a Catholic was an important part of Tolkien's identity, and his personal values, fears and concerns would naturally be manifested in his work.
You're obliged, any author I imagine, is obliged to call on his stock, private stock.
I am dreading the publication, for it will be impossible not to mind what is said. I have exposed my heart to be shot at.
Tolkien wanted The Lord of the Rings published in one huge volume, with the Silmarillion attached, but the publishers refused, and so the book was split into 3 volumes and published from 1954 to 1955. When it was finally issued in its entirety, for the most part the reviews were positive.
One reviewer once said, "This is a jolly, jolly book, isn't it? All the right boys come home and everybody's happy and glad." He said, "It isn't true, of course. He can't have read the story."
His good friend C.S. Lewis wrote enthusiastically to Tolkien,
"I congratulate you. All the long years you have spent on it are justified,"
and championed him in print. The poet W.H. Auden called it
"a masterpiece,"
and in his review in the New York Times compared it to Milton's Paradise Lost. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien takes Anglo-Saxon and Norse sagas, ancient Celtic poetry, Milton, Dickens, Browning and more, to create his world. But his comparison with Milton is an important one. Historically, great poets aspire to write a national epic in imitation of Homer or Virgil. Milton famously tried to go beyond the boundaries of a national epic to explain the origins of all humanity. Many have argued that The Lord of the Rings is a national epic for England or Europe in general. Tolkien was never as explicit as Milton in his motives, but admitted he was inspired by Finland's national epic, the Kalevala, and throughout his life insisted that Middle-earth was not an imaginary world, but rather an imaginary historical moment in our very real world. Tolkien's new genre, heroic fantasy, epic fantasy, world-building fiction, whatever we choose to call it, is now a huge part of our culture, and has inspired an entire industry of movies, books and games centered around epic quests in new worlds. Without Tolkien, would we even have Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, or games like Dungeons and Dragons, World of Warcraft, Magic: The Gathering? Tolkien was a giant of literature who created a world so fully formed, so complex, and so enigmatic that we forget that the creation of Middle-earth changed the entire literary landscape.
Of course, The Lord of the Rings does not belong to me. It has been brought forth and must now go its appointed way in the world, though naturally I take a deep interest in its fortunes as a parent would of a child. I am comforted to know that it has good friends to defend it against the malice of its enemies.
And now for a quick ad. The Manhattan Rare Book Company specializes in fine books, manuscripts, art, and photography. They offer only items that have been carefully selected to meet their high standards of quality and importance. At the moment, Manhattan Rare Books is featuring a number of items by J.R.R. Tolkien, including 2 letters written by Tolkien introducing The Lord of the Rings to a fan of The Hobbit, and a highly important Tolkien manuscript, complete with a beautiful hand-drawn genealogical chart. Details and images can be found at manhattanrarebooks.com. Please feel free to contact them to discuss your collecting interests. Whether you are looking for a specific book, manuscript, or photograph, or have more general questions concerning collecting, they will be happy to provide their assistance. Thanks for listening.